Bold Bytes, your bite-sized guide to payments.
I want to say thank you to everyone for joining today. Today actually marks the first of the education series for 2026. These webinars that I will be doing are designed to educate those that don't know, maybe strengthen the expertise of those who do, and also help everyone consider several perspectives that are included in this industry. So every month I will be presenting or hosting a panel discussion with industry experts to discuss the many levels of the payments industry. Some upcoming topics that we will be doing are PCI compliance in February, so please make sure you attend that one. And then the main event is going to be in March when we're going to be discussing KYC, foundational KYC, and how to definitely strengthen your relationships with your merchants to have a better experience overall. So today we will be discussing the journey of a transaction through the eyes of the merchant, the processor, and the ISO. And basically, why does a transaction that's approved at the terminal not necessarily mean that it's approved for the account? So everybody knows that when you go into a store, go into a restaurant, you are going to have some sort of payment that goes through that includes a exchange of goods and services for money. And in the eyes of the customer and the merchant, that's basically where that process stops. So for the life cycle of the authorization, the card holder will present their card. It will be inserted or tap to pay or swiped or even keyed at the terminal. And then the data capture that occurs from the information on the cardholder's card gets passed through basically instantaneously through several areas within the payment processing industry. So starts with the terminal communicating with the acquirer, which is where the VAR sheet, where the file build for the terminal has originated from. Then it will pass through to the card networks, where it will transfer the communication to the cardholder's bank, where it will then have a confirmation on whether or not that transaction is allowed to go through. And then once we get either a approval or decline, that response will pass through all of the areas it's already gone through and return to the terminal and give us the response that we're looking for. So there are several areas within that first process where a customer or a merchant can experience some sort of delay or decline or rejection. It can start out first with just getting the data capture at the terminal. So the chip reader or the mag reader could be malfunctioning, not working. When it goes to start to try to speak with the acquirer, there could be an issue within the file build at the terminal that's causing you maybe get a receive error or something, some sort of communication lost that says you cannot actually access the next step of this transaction. Then, once it gets through and starts communicating with the cardholder's bank, that's where you can see the response codes. That's usually where the decline's really going to be coming from, is whether or not they have a security feature that requires them to approve the transaction, whether or not their card has already been reported as lost or stolen. That could cause the decline, or even if they just don't have enough funds in their account in order to actually be able to let the transaction go through. So there are several points within that initial system that can lead to just the transaction itself, the authorization itself, not going through. But let's say it does. Let's say every single part of it goes through and we head over to the clearing and the settlement side. So this is where we all come in. This is where we all kind of deal with everything. And then most importantly, this is where my department, the risk department, sees the most action is because once it's in this area, that's where all the rest of the stakeholders now have an opportunity to understand whether or not this transaction is A, legitimate, B, causing further risk exposure, or C, just in general not something that anyone feels comfortable with, and or they just want some more information because it's outside of what they were expecting for the account. So during the life cycle of the settlement, what most people don't know, and what, or they might know it but maybe forget, or maybe just don't want to believe it, is that every other part of the transaction process, every other stakeholder acts as part of as a credit system for the merchant. So as much as a merchant would like to think that as soon as they exchange payment for goods and services, that that money is in fact theirs, the terminal itself does not spit out cash in order for them to be able to get paid immediately. So in the process of the cardholder's bank transferring money to the acquiring bank and letting and paying out the merchant, that part takes a lot longer than the normal next day funding time frame that the merchant is then expecting. So what happens is, because there is a agreement amongst all of the levels involved in the transaction, the processor fronts that money to the merchant before they even get paid. And that's where the risk exposure and the risk levels come into play for the processor itself, because they are the ones that have to determine whether or not they're comfortable with that information going through. So I would say, honestly, in my time in this department, I would say honestly, 99% of transactions go through without any complaint, any fail. They are processed correctly, they're in a batch of transactions processed correctly, and they are funded in the time frame that is agreed upon with the merchant's contract. That 1% of transactions that we end up getting involved in are ones that are going to have a variable that risk does not feel comfortable with and wants to be able to look into further. When they're looking at these transactions, most importantly, they want to make sure that the risk exposure that they are ready to take liability on is not going to be expanded by this transaction. Has it already been agreed upon that they're comfortable with this risk exposure? And any risk exposure basically falls on three levels. There's going to be financial, so money lost; fraudulent, so is somebody either trying to pull one over on the merchant, or is the merchant trying to pull one over on the processor? And then reputational, just, are you doing something that's completely incorrect in terms of the industry that you're underwritten for? And that's when we go into a review, and there are several reasons why a transaction would go into a review. So mostly we see that it's a large transaction that just kind of exceeds the approved parameters. It's not usually, I have partners ask me this all the time. Is it, what's the number that we're looking for? What, is it $1,000? Is it $1,500? What's the number that's going to cause this to be held? And it doesn't really work that way. It more so has to do with the monthly volume and the average ticket and even the history of the account and what was approved and what has been going on. So if you were only approved for $40,000 monthly volume and you process a $12,000 and a $10,000 transaction in one day, well, you've just taken up more than half of what your allotted monthly volume is. So unless you're planning on not processing anymore for the rest of the month, that doesn't really, it doesn't make sense. And they don't understand that math because it's not what we agreed upon. Other reasons are going to be just even like entry mode. So if it's a account that was not approved for any key transactions, and then they key, especially a large transaction, That has a much higher risk for chargebacks, has much higher risk for losing the chargeback. And therefore, you're going to see that loss, that financial loss come through, and they're going to want to do everything that they can, the processor is, to protect the merchant and themselves in this process. So, as mentioned, even account authorization history. So, if they've been with the processor for several years and are normally running transactions between $100 and $500, and then they process $1,000 transaction or process of more so like a $15,000 transaction, that's going to cause a flag and reason for a review to be started. Large transactions that are split on the same card. So if you go to try to run a $100,000 transaction and it doesn't go through, so then you put in four $25,000 transactions and they all go through, well, I'm sure you all have had experience with chargebacks that are for duplicate transactions or things of that nature where it looks as if a card was accidentally ran 4 times for the same amount. And that can also be disputed by the bank. It can be disputed as fraud. And especially if it's a keyed transaction, the merchant would 100% lose those chargebacks, and that $100,000 will be eliminated from their account. Maybe the card declined several times before the authorization, especially if it's for suspected fraud or not authorized, no authorization. Those are areas where that could definitely be leading toward stolen card, fraudulent activity, and they want to make sure that they get in front of it before there's an issue. Refunds above certain amounts or refunds with no offsetting sales. Sometimes things happen, right? A new employee inputs a transaction, runs the transaction, and they accidentally ran a refund instead of a authorization. That happens. We have that happen several times a month, and we have to reach out, and sometimes they say, nope, that was supposed to be an authorization. Please reject the transaction and rekey it for us. And that's why risk is involved, is because they want to be able to stop things like that. Other times it's disgruntled employees. They're refunding their accounts because they want extra money. Other times it's just a transaction that the card that they used when they purchased it is no longer available. It was lost, stolen, renewed, what have you. And now they're getting a refund on a new card. And they just want to make sure that it's not fraudulent. Behavior outside of the industry allowance. So that would be, keyed transactions at a liquor store that requires age verification processes. And when you do a key transaction in the eyes of the banks and the processors, even if it is card present and keyed, it is still considered a card not present transaction because you can't prove that, really. You cannot prove that. So it is definitely something where if it's or even just behavior outside of the industry. So a nail salon, your average ticket is really going to be about $150. Running a $22,000 transaction is usually not something that happens. And so if it does pop up, it's something where you want to understand why. Non-standard repeating charge types. So that would be, we have been experiencing a lot of notifications about EBT fraud, whether this is happening at the merchant level or the customer level. Basically, they are running transactions for $200 even, either multiple times a day or multiple times a week. And with EBT, as we all understand, those are food stamps. That's a cash allowance. So how could $200 even exactly be ran multiple times in 1 week on the same card at the same location? So this is areas where we've seen trends in fraudulent activity. And so when those trends pop up, we have to address them. And then other behavioral situations. So card testing, bin testing, when you see multiple declines over and over and over again, small dollar amounts, things that are coming through as e-commerce or keyed or anything along those lines where they're obviously accessing the website and testing cards in order to see which ones get authorizations and which ones they can continue using in a fraudulent manner. So these are some of the reasons. Now, I will say these are not all of the reasons. Unfortunately, that is not how we can really function. We cannot actually give you every single reason for why a transaction could be flagged, because There are several variables that go into a risk review basically at any point. And so even though this is nine reasons why something could get flagged, that's just, barely touching the surface. So variables that matter. This is broken down kind of into category, but the long and short of it is basically any piece of information that has to do with an account, an industry, regulations with with the card brands, the processors, just the information within the transaction. All of these are considered when going through a risk review. So with business fundamentals, you're going to look at industry type and the regulations behind that industry, the account lifespan and trends. So if the account's been with the processor for years and they're starting to see an uptick in activity, that's just for us, what we hope for is that it's just the business growing and we want to just verify, make sure, and move forward. But if it's a brand new account, the most fraudulent activity happens within the first 60 days. So when that does occur, if they were boarded with a $50 average ticket and the first batch that they have has thousands of dollars of transactions in it, all for large amounts, something's wrong. Something was not either something was inaccurate when they were submitting the information, or this is complete fraudulent activity and we have to address it as quickly as possible. Or just their business structure. So a restaurant can have large tickets if they do large tables, catering, even private events. But if they have a situation where maybe they take deposits and that wasn't spoken about during underwriting, that exceeds the risk exposure that was agreed upon. And that's when a conversation is going to be had and documentation is going to need to be provided. The transaction details. So they will look at the dollar amount, the entry mode, whether or not there were declines, and again, delivery time frame for the goods and services. So that would mostly go with kind of a contracting industry. So seeing whether or not what they're purchasing has already been completed, or if this was a payment for a job that will be completed in 30 to 60 days. So system intelligence, some things actually are automated flags. So with the refunds with no offsetting sales or with card testing or things of that nature, there are systems in place where they see a spike in decline activity or they see large refund activity. And that's where it will trigger the risk department to look further into what's going on. And if they notice any issues with the information, then that's when they'll reach out to us and then we'll start the review process with you all. Compliance framework. So this would be card brand regulations, even acquirer requirements, which is very difficult to say as I am saying that out loud, and then platform rules and risk tiers. So some industries have higher risk. And so if you see riskier activity within that, that can snowball very quickly. And so you want to get ahead of it and make sure that if this merchant was either boarded incorrectly, boarded with the wrong MCC code, boarded with the wrong parameters, that we're able to write that course as quickly as possible, especially in the newer parts of the account. Otherwise, this could be something where the fraud has started and we didn't do what we could. We didn't do our due diligence to ensure that that fraud ceases in a timely manner. And then account profile, again, maybe it's a restaurant that was boarded and it's boarded as a restaurant, MCC code is a restaurant, but maybe there was a conversation during underwriting where they were saying that they do, a wine membership and they also sell wine on site that is in a little store type area within their restaurant. And so during underwriting, there were notes placed on the account talking about how this specific activity needs to be put on a different mid. They can't do that activity on this account. They're going to take those pieces of information they're going to take that into account when they're doing the review, because they want to make sure that if we've already decided that this is something that you can't do, that they are monitoring it until they know that you have, especially the merchant, has been made aware and will not be a part of that type of activity. So there are a couple of different risk responses. There's 3 tiers, low, medium, and high, where this is going to depend on how the review is handled. So we have people sometimes where they're like, well, why is this transaction being held? This is just what they do. Or we've already had this conversation, what's going on? Other times, the account's not placed on hold at all, and we start to see a little less cooperation with actually providing the documentation that we're requesting because their funding is going through. Why would they actually care about providing any information? But what I want, especially you all, to understand, and something that I hope we can help pass along to merchants, is that the way that risk reaches out and the way that the response begins with a risk review is either a sign of respect, a sign of understanding, or a sign of worry. And when they reach out and how they reach out is going to be a huge determination and set the tone for the rest of the review. And if they set the tone with a low risk and the merchant responds very high riskily, we are going to see the risk department's trust start to shift. And then we're going to have to recalibrate and figure out how to get everything back on track where everybody's happy, which unfortunately we will never make everybody happy, but where we can get something in the middle for everyone to be okay with. Starting off at the bottom, low risk, this we see usually either with accounts that are brand new, that were recently re-apped, or accounts that have been seasoned, have been with the processor for a very, very long time, and a transaction happens that's just not making a lot of sense. So sometimes an account will go through underwriting, and for some reason, instead of putting $100,000 as their monthly volume, they put $10,000, but their average ticket is, let's say, $1,000. So in underwriting, that doesn't really get caught, especially in certain industries. Some industries just kind of go through an auto approval process. But that information itself, so you're telling me that your average ticket is $1,000 and you're planning to only do 10 transactions a month? That also doesn't make any sense. So if in the first batch you have 3 $1,000 transactions, now risk is going to flag that and go, did we maybe miss a zero in the monthly volume? Is this accurate? Would you like to review the parameters that are approved on this account and maybe let us know if we need to change anything? That way we can get ahead of it in the beginning and mitigate and even eliminate risk reviews moving forward because something was wrong and now we can fix it. So usually in those situations, especially with a low risk response, the transaction might go under review, but the account itself won't go on a funding hold. So they'll want some information. And even with the seasoned account, that's a sign of respect. They see that this is not something that you normally do, but they want to understand, what is this? Have you started marketing differently? Have you added a new sector of your business that is causing a spike? Or is this an incorrect transaction? Is there something wrong? And so it's just kind of helping get ahead of it and verify the information without stopping any type of cash flow because the risk exposure is pretty low. Medium response is going to be kind of a give and take. So sometimes what we see is the transaction itself is actually funded, but then the account goes on review and placed on a funding hold to maybe collect possible funds that might be needed for this transaction that now has been flagged, and there's a gut feeling. There's something going on that's making risk uncomfortable with what's happening. And again, several variables that can be used within this risk review process. So if maybe 8 out of 10 items are checking off and it all makes sense, but the last 2 items are just not sitting well. Maybe the card declined twice for suspected fraud, and we just want to understand Did it decline and the customer called their bank and said, hey, it's cool, this is mine, and then we did it again and it was able to be approved? Or what are the circumstances? What are the different variables that we need to understand to feel comfortable with this transaction? So the transaction would have gone through and they said, okay, fine, whatever. Then they go, but something's not really matching or adding up. And so I do want to just get some more information. So that's usually what will happen with a medium risk response. High risk responses are going to be something very wrong is happening, whether it's a trend in transactions within the first 60 days, whether it's stuff that's just completely outside the realm of parameters. So, and I will go through a transaction example on the next slide, but this would be a situation where maybe what they see, they're saying this is definitely not normal practice for a merchant in this industry, or based on their history, or maybe this is a fraudulent attempt, or there's an entire batch of, $10,000 refunds all going to the same card. I want to make sure that your account is safe. I want to make sure that everything is okay. So we're going to place everything on hold and make sure that you are taken care of, or that we're not going to experience any loss. And I say we as in the processor, we're not going to experience any financial loss based on us not acting appropriately. So those are going to be the three tiers, and you'll see a range of them. And what my team, Patty and I, what we do is we like to make sure that when there is a situation where maybe the transaction in question is $1,000 or $2,000 and it gets held, but then they put the account on 100% funding hold. It takes us a while to actually get the merchant to respond with the items that we need. And the next thing we know, there's $75,000 on hold. We understand that $2,000 is not making or breaking this account. So that's where we will step in and request that they remove the hold and release the funds that aren't under review. That maybe it's taking a while to verify the cardholder information. Maybe it's taking a while to get the invoices. Maybe there's upper management that needs to review some things. And so we'll do what we can to help bridge that gap so that funding can continue, but so that the processor is also being taken care of. And in some circumstances, they will refuse, or they'll keep a little bit more on hand if they see other suspicious activity that's happened after that transaction and that they're still not feeling okay with it. So many variables and many reasons for us to maybe have a bad day sometimes. So we do what we can to mitigate issues, but otherwise, for the most part, we are able to continue healthy relationships both with our partners and with the processor. So here's a transaction example. I love using liquor stores because there's just so many nuanced pieces to a liquor store that when certain areas go wrong, we're able to explain it much easier and make it very known why this is happening. So with this transaction example, we're hypothetically, it's a liquor store that was boarded on February 15th with a $40,000 monthly volume and a $100 average ticket. A liquor store is required to be 100% swiped and card present. We have learned recently that there are some areas that have more restrictions than areas that don't. So as an example, Fiserv is very against having keyed transactions on liquor stores. It's mostly due to the banks that they have been with. So that regulation mostly comes from Wells Fargo, which is what we have normally been using with Fiserv. However, what we've also learned is that with TSYS they have an issue with transactions that are keyed with liquor stores. However, they do have a little bit more leniency when it comes to B2B. So they understand that if a restaurant is purchasing their liquor and their wine and what have you from one specific location, and there's deliveries and there's, invoices and there's an actual ability to confirm those transactions, TSYS usually is a little bit more lenient with it, but that's because Synovus is more lenient with that, especially with B2B. So what we've also been able to work with is that Fiserv North is now with Synovus. So although Fiserv has had this type of regulatory issue, because they now have the ability to also board with Synovus, they have leniency under the North platform to do B2B keyed transactions and be okay with it. So that's something that I don't know for sure, but has shifted in the more recent years, because I've noticed that businesses and merchants that own liquor stores, they tend to respond with, I didn't know I couldn't key transactions. That's never happened before. Why would I even have the keying function if that's a thing? I've been in this industry for 20 years. We've heard it all. So it's one area where we definitely see a lot of activity in that, because we've also seen an uptick in fraud. We've seen an uptick in chargebacks where a customer comes in, oh, my card's not working. And it's because their card is a fraudulent card. And so they key the transaction, they walk out with the liquor store, and then they do friendly fraud chargebacks, and the merchant loses out on their merchandise and the payment that they received for it. So in this circumstance, in this example transaction, the merchant runs a $10,000 transaction keyed. In this specific circumstance, it declined twice for suspected fraud and then went through as an authorization. Because there's high chargeback rates for keyed liquor sales, and because alcohol sales require age verification and a key transaction is considered card not present, this is going to flag. This is going to flag in the system because a quarter of the approved monthly volume was ran as a key transaction, declined twice as suspected fraud, and the account is brand new. There's a lot of pieces of information here that risk is going to say, I don't like this, account on hold, let's review what's going on. Now we're going to get into the different perspectives. So the merchant perspective. And when I say merchant perspective, I'm talking about the owner of the account, the one who is on the client page within the platform. Now, the day in the life of an owner, they're thinking about the inventory for their location. They're thinking about the payroll for their employees. They're thinking about the holidays that are coming up. They're thinking about their own personal life and their families. A lot of owners, as I'm sure you all will agree, especially in certain industries, are not usually hands-on in the day-to-day. So they're not standing behind the counter running that $10,000 transaction and watching their inventory go out the door. They're at home, or they're dealing with the other businesses that they own, or they're not standing there and witnessing what's happening. So all they care about is whether or not things are functioning properly. So their efficiency expectations are going to be, is the terminal functioning, and is it quick? Is it actually giving me the payments fast enough for my customers to feel comfortable and walk out the door? They want the transactions to be successful, so they don't want any declines, and they want consistent funding. So now, in just the merchant perspective at location, whoever the employee or the manager is that is completing this $10,000 transaction, to them, everything's fine. The transaction was successful, exchange of goods and services completed, transaction approved, customer walks out the door with their inventory or with the merchandise, and they say, hey, we did it. Successful day, guys. Look at what we did. And then this transaction gets placed on hold, high risk. Processor is not okay with it. They put the account on hold. So now the owner, who hasn't been involved, goes and checks their bank account. They didn't get their batch from the day before. So now they're calling the ISO, usually screaming some expletives and some other yelling, and basically saying that money is mine. The merchandise is already out of my store. I need to be paid. Pay me now. Fix this. And that's where the education and the gaps within their knowledge of this industry are so important, because if that's how they think, and they think that something ran on their terminal means it's theirs, then they don't understand the stakeholder hierarchy that every single person has agreed to be involved in, and that the processor and the acquiring bank are giving this merchant this money before they've even been paid it. And that is where the cycle has a gap in knowledge, and the merchant will always be upset until they understand. And I can speak for my team. We have conversations with merchants where we explain that to them and they go, oh, okay, that makes sense. But they're upset up until that point. So if we're able to get ahead of that, if our ISOs and our partners are able to get ahead of that and explain these types of situations, just even during onboarding, even bringing them into their portfolio and creating an agreement, that is something that's going to help leaps and bounds the frustration and the issues that we see with risk reviews. So then looking at the processor perspective. So talk about day in the life. The risk department at a processor has several responsibilities, and it's not just for the one person or the one company. So the risk department, let's say our processor that we use mostly, Priority Payment Systems, let's say they just had any partner or merchant that was dealing with Bold integrated payments versus check. Great. Then that's a pretty easy day. They don't, though. It's not just us. They have several portfolios. They have several partners that they deal with. And so they're responsible for these things on my screen for every single person. So they have to protect all stakeholders from fraud. So that includes the customer. Is the customer aware of what they paid for and when they're expecting the delivery of that payment? Is the merchant protected? Is this transaction fraudulent? And will they receive a $10,000 chargeback? Is the processor, acquiring banks and card networks, are they all taken care of for the sake of they're the ones who are handing out this $10,000? If the merchant gets a chargeback, ACH rejects it, and loses this money, the processor is going to be responsible for that. And they don't want to have to cover it. This wasn't their fault. So that's why they're going to put this transaction in review and get ahead of this. So they're protecting all stakeholders from fraud. They're also protecting all stakeholders from financial loss. So same group of people, everybody in there has the opportunity to lose money with this transaction, and they want to get ahead of it and see if they can fix it now before it gets too late. Regulatory compliance. So this has to do with any acquiring bank or card holder, card brand, or any rules and regulations that have to do, even laws that have to do with the industry that they're in and the way that these payments are being handled. An example is a merchant using their own card to give themselves a $10,000 payout before so that they can pay out their employees. That's against regulations. That's not something that is allowed. So they have to address that as quickly as possible and make sure that that's not what's happening. Partnership management. So the risk department also has us as partners. They have a good relationship with us. I have worked very hard to have a good relationship with the risk department for years. And so when I request something to be handled, I'm having to look at it a little bit differently as well, because although I want to make every merchant and partner happy and not feel uncomfortable about the fact that someone's money is on hold, if I don't trust the transaction or what's going on with the situation, I won't be reaching out to the processor and say, you have to do this and you have to trust me, because that's now putting my relationship on the line with them. So they have to work on that with us as well. They don't want to just put every single partner and merchant of ours on 100% hold and have me coming to them and being like, what's going on? Why are you doing this? Like, this is not how this works. So they're trying to have a better relationship with us while we're trying to have a better relationship with them, while also protecting every person that's involved within the process. So it is a balancing act, and I'll explain a little bit further. One thing that the head of risk at Priority Payment Systems and I have spoken about is how much the process for going under risk review is an art and a science. There are specifics that cause the science to come through where they are not doing what they said they were going to be doing. It is not what they said it was going to be. Therefore, science review. Other areas is where the art comes into play. You have to utilize all the variables that are in the mix to pick and choose where something will make sense on one account that really, really will not make sense on a different account. And the combination and the accumulation of those variables matters to the end result and the end decision. And then lastly, trend intelligence. So all the people that are within the analyst team have to know what kind of fraudulent trends come through on what industries and what to look out for so that they can be aware of it and they can address it as quickly as possible. So now we're looking at the ISO perspective. So this would be all of you. There's two ways that this can go down for you all. And we hope that you will always have to deal with the left side, the blue side. We will always have to, which I did not mean to make this a political thing. So please don't look at anything on my screen as a political statement, but I will let you know that bold is blue, and that's why we have that there. So with bold, we are here to make sure that we're talking to it with risk and that we're providing you the information. So when you hear from us, you actually have the time to set the tone of the conversation with the merchant. Ask as many questions to us as you can so that when you go to explain this to the merchant, you have the information. You have the ability to educate them quickly. You also might already know things about the merchant. They might have already called you and told you about this $10,000 transaction. So you're actually able to educate us quickly on some of the pieces of the information so that we can go ahead and pass that to the risk department and get that process taken care of. And that way we're dealing with it a little bit more proactively because we're setting the tone, right? Now, there are some instances where human error, things happen at the processor, they get busy, something gets placed on hold automatically from an automatic flag on a day where they're closed for a holiday. And then the merchant contacts you first. And so they're the ones that are setting the tone. And they're the ones that are now going to be a little bit more resistant with actually providing anything that's needed because they feel that they've been taken advantage of. They don't know if they can trust what's happening. So because you're met with hostility and you have to now go into a reactionary state, you're having to now come to us and now the communication is all lost. And what I pride my team for doing is helping get everybody back to the same tone and make sure that everyone understands that this is not a personal attack. This is obviously a behavioral situation. It's not that you're bad or you did something wrong talking to the merchant. It's that something is wrong and we need to figure out what that is. And maybe there's just a lack of education within your industry to understand that that's an incorrect way of doing things. So ensuring that we are the ones to contact you first helps create a much smoother process. And we understand that sometimes it's just there's a level of intensity because you want to do right for your merchants, you want to advocate for them. So, we're prepared to take the heat that comes, but we are there to help. We are there to educate and get anything that we can to get this cash flow continued as long as it's a legitimate business, as long as there's no reason to worry about what it is that this merchant's doing. So why should you care? As an ISO, why should you care? I know probably every single person on this call thought to themselves at one point during the stakeholder conversation, like, I care if Visa loses any money. Like, I care if Synovus loses any money. Like, I care if the processor loses any money. I care about my merchants. I want my merchants to be okay. And risk reviews are nonsense. They're not necessary, what have you. There are several reasons why you should care. So first of all, consistent losses, they damage relationships. That's damage relationships with us, damage relationships with the processor, and even damage your own relationships with your own merchants. So if you're constantly seeing negative losses on your monthly commissions and things of that nature because the merchants that are coming on are not behaving the way that they need to and they're attriting, you're having to constantly make up that difference, and you're actually going to be doing more work for yourselves to get that process to smooth out. And having an efficient book requires consistency. So if we have partners that are constant. Let's say we have a partner that's constantly bringing on fraudulent accounts or constantly bringing something in that we end up having to get closed by risk because they were placed on match or it was identity theft or what have you. That puts a damper on our relationship with the processor to trust us that the people that we're advocating for are not doing something wrong. And we're constantly in that balance, having that balance with them. So we want to make sure that you're successful and we want you to be trusting in us that we've got your back. And so we want to make sure that you're doing everything that you can to protect yourselves and your book of business, because that also can lead to reputational issues, which I'll talk about in the cost of attrition. But yeah, so you do want to make sure that you have a consistent book so that you can have consistent and healthy relationships. Also, damage control. So if a customer, let's say this $10,000 liquor store customer, charges back or disputes a transaction, they have up to 270 days to do that. That is 9 months out of the year to be able to take care of disputing this transaction. And if this large transaction comes through and risk asks for invoices and cardholder information and bank statements to make sure that you're okay and that you'll be able to cover the loss if it does come through, and we deal with it now. We deal with it while the evidence is fresh. We deal with it when the inventory has just now been lost. We deal with it when the issue is right in front of us. It has now presented itself and we can take care of it immediately. And then we can either wrap it up and close it out, or we can refund it or figure out a different alternative form of payment, something in that moment. It's a lot easier to have that conversation with the merchant right then than it is 270 days down the road when a $10,000 transaction comes through negative on their account as a chargeback and they don't have the funds to take care of it, and their account ACH rejects and they're barely processing as it is, and then their account goes on a funding hold to recover that $10,000 ACH reject. And now they say, well, I want my funds. And we're saying there's legitimately nothing we can do about it. You don't have enough funds in your bank account for this extremely large chargeback. So you are going to have a much harder time educating the merchant when the house is on fire than you do in the beginning when you say, hey, just want to let you know that fire over there could very easily get out of control. We want to make sure that you have all the preparations in order to take care of that fire before we move forward with this. So it's a lot easier to deal with the potential of loss today than it is for the actual loss months down the road when the payment that you received has already been spent, the inventory is already gone, the card holders changed their name and left the country. These are things where you can't really come back from. And then that leads to my third point, which is cost of attrition. So you spend all of this time and energy and money bringing merchants onto your book and investing in their trusting you and your relationship. And to lose that merchant, you lose out on that entire investment. So in that process, you're not only taking a financial loss because you've now just lost the money that normally is coming in. It's an emotional toll because now, especially if it happens multiple times, you have to regroup and find a different way of bringing on new people, and it takes that emotional energy back. And reputational damage. People talk, merchants talk. Small towns have very small, have big reputations, and when you are not able to make a merchant happy, they can very easily take that information and go to anybody else that they know and say, don't trust that person because I lost money or they put my account on hold, and then they never educated me, they never told me anything, I hate them. You don't want to trust them, and that's not something we want for any of you. The cost of retention and educating the merchant and giving them the ability to understand beforehand and having that foundational KYC from the beginning is going to be so much better for your book of business and your success than just yelling to get it completed, right? To get a review completed just because you want them to be happy now. real quick before we get started on Q&A, I do want to let you know that loss of trust in any relationship is very difficult to rebuild. So for everyone involved, the trust needs to be there and it needs to be maintained. So it's imperative that every ISO, every partner is a part of that trust building. And we at Bold are going to be committed to helping each and every one of our partners and merchants succeed. And we will use our industry knowledge and our expertise to mitigate any issues that may arise. If we don't know the answer, we are going to find the answer. However, you hold the merchant relationship in your hands. So you're the ones who initiated that connection. So you have the most access and they have the most trust in you. They don't know us, they know you. So if you show that you don't trust the system and that you aren't sure whether or not we have your backs, they're definitely not going to trust the system. So I hope that this communication and the education series that I will be doing will help you feel a little bit better about that trust. And I hope that we can help build a stronger future for you all. So thank you all for listening. I am going to start the Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to place them in the chat. I'll be happy to answer anything you have. I do want to also remind you all that I do have some upcoming presentations. And so in February of 2026, we will be hosting, or I will be hosting a PCI compliance deep dive where I'll help you understand why we do PCI compliance, how to do PCI compliance, and why it's important to help our merchants avoid fines and violations. And in March of 2026, we'll be doing a foundational KYC. This is going to basically go over how having a really strong understanding of your merchants and how they function, how they are structured, and how they plan to operate in the beginning will severely help you not have to deal with me and my team as much. Providing as much information as you can in the underwriting process will help you not have to deal with risk as much. So that's something I want to help you all because I know that a funding hold can lead to a lot of issues, and we want to make sure that you're all protected from that. All right, looks like I have some questions. So why is there a monthly limit volume? So the monthly limit is really based on what your projected volume is supposed to be, so that the processor can understand where it is that you're going. So if you come in and say, hey, I'm going to be running $1 million, they're going to say, are you absolutely sure? Can we see some prior processing statements? What makes you think you're going to be running $1 million? Because that's a pretty high risk. If you come in and you say, I'm going to be doing $10,000, and then you severely exceed that, they say, well, I don't understand why you said $10,000. Now I'm concerned as to what it is that you are doing with your business, and I don't know if I trust what's going on. So they place that there so that they can understand what the agreement is. And then that way, if it does change, if it does need to be altered, if we were just completely wrong, they have no problem updating it. They just want to understand what's going on. And so it's there to help guide them on whether or not a review is necessary. So thank you for your question, Opal. Will the slides be available to us? Yes, once we get the recording for this, we will be sending out the recording to all registered attendees as well as the slide deck that I created. What if it is a new merchant and will not know how much they should estimate? It's a great question. I would say go with a smaller amount that will help encapsulate it. So maybe like a $50,000 or $75,000, depending on the industry too. So it depends on what kind of ticket types they are. If they're a convenience store and their normal transactions are going to be $10 to $25, then having a smaller amount will help with that. If they're a construction company and they're planning to have renovations that cost thousands of dollars, then you're going to want to make sure that it accumulates, it has the total for whatever that amount would look like at a great month, right? So you want to kind of determine in those cases. And then because they don't have prior processing, risk and underwriting might ask some more questions in the beginning of the process, and there might be some risk reviews. but then we can kind of work together because everybody has a starting point, right? You can't have knowledge if you don't really have experience on it. So that's one way that I would say to do it. What documentation or how should restaurants notify underwriting that they do catering services in order to avoid holds for catering services? So I personally would say that it depends on how much catering they do. If they are something where they legitimately have, it could easily be two very different businesses. I would honestly have two separate MIDs underwritten differently so that the contracts and the deposits and anything that goes within the catering can be underwritten and reviewed one way, where the card present normal table transactions are being handled a different way. If it is just a part of their business, maybe less than 20% of their normal volume, I would basically provide copies of past invoices and past contracts. I would definitely have some sort of contract that communicates what deposits they do, refund policies, cancellation policies, things of that nature, so that basically the merchant is protecting themselves with these contracts, and so that underwriting knows that they have something specific that they hand to every single one of their customers to make sure that there's no ambiguity, right? So that they know what they're expecting and the customer knows what they're expecting. And with the different documentation, again, just having either a past situation or just an example will allow underwriting to really understand what their plans are and how they function and how they document cardholder information and payment receivings and different payment timeframes as well. So thank you for your question, Maya. Will you folks at Bold let us know how to create the percentages you place on merchants? Does it vary from merchant to merchant based on monthly gross sales? Yes. So that is Robert. Robert, I will get your information to our growth management team and they can help you better understand that question. So when it comes to creating a percentage, that is also based on how they are planning to operate. So if they have a dual pricing or surcharge structure or something along those lines, then that pricing will want to be incorporated on the back end. And then, based on their industry, there's different interchange rates, there's different high risk transactions. So that would change the information on that end. But I will definitely make sure that I get your email and your name over to our growth management team and have someone reach out to you. How would you advise guiding a merchant who is threatening to move to another processor? It's a great question, Patty. Some processors have more risk aversion than other processors. There are some processors out there, they will take anything. They don't care what the industry is. They don't care the way that the transactions are going to be run. And the information will definitely be handled a little differently. The processors that we work with do have an average risk aversion. So if a merchant wants to go to a different processor, they obviously can. We obviously don't want them to, but they will have the responsibility of ensuring that their account is set up correctly. So it could be a circumstance where they just were underwritten wrong. The information is incorrect. And if the information is incorrect, then we want to fix it. We want to rectify it. And we're happy to do that. And everything should work out from that point on. However, if they are legitimately doing fraudulent activity and they say, well, I'm going to leave, I want my money, this is where I'm going. Just because you leave doesn't mean the money gets released to you. In fact, your reaction of leaving might actually lead to the processor holding the funds for the full 270 days, because now your variable of the merchant response has now created cause for concern. So if they are outright refusing to give everything and they just want to jump ship, that's likely going to make the processor even a little more weary and not really understand what's going on and want to make sure that they're taken care of, because this merchant will likely close their bank account, not allow fees to go through, and ACH reject any fee or chargeback removals that come from their account. So it's a great question, but I do think that would be the best way to go. If a restaurant is taking a payment over the phone and select card not present, what is the severity of the impact of the transaction? So thank you, Opal. That's a great question. Chargebacks that are keyed entry that are disputed for transaction not authorized or suspected fraud, the merchant 100% will lose that dispute. So even if they have a receipt that has, a signature or anything like that, because it is a keyed transaction, it's just the way the disputes work. It's considered card not present, and therefore the merchant will lose it if it gets disputed. So recommendation for anything along those lines is if they're going to take a card over the phone, personally, if I were running a business, and from what I know of the restaurant industry at this point, is I would maybe get the order and then collect payment when they get there. Keying transactions is very, very difficult to come back from. So if it's someone that they know, if it's a regular, if it's somebody that they've never had issues with, even in that situation, I've had people legitimately turn to me after they've gotten 70 chargebacks come through on their account for the same card and say, I know this guy. He comes in twice a week. He's 100% him. These are legitimate transactions. And he was using a stolen card, and he had a great personality, and he made friends with all the hosts and all the managers and everybody, but he was doing friendly fraud, and that is a legitimate fear for merchants. So I would recommend that they don't do it, that the only time you're really ever keying something is if you have some sort of credit card authorization, contract, things like that, where it's, maybe a catering or an event where they're putting a deposit in and there's a legitimate, this is how much is being paid for here, this is how much is being paid for here, this much is being paid for here. The problem is that if that gets charged back and if it gets dispute, the merchant will likely lose it. And that is not something that we want. So recommendation is don't. If they have to, protect yourselves as much as possible. Can you update the average purchase on new merchants? Thank you, Guillermo. Yes, you can. So if you have already submitted an application and the average ticket you placed at $100, and as they got started, you realize, well, that actually should have been $1,000. Oh, it should have been $500. 100%. There are ways of submitting cases through the platform, especially through priority payment systems who we work with mostly. You can even just reach out to our client services team or our risk team and just request that be handled, and then we can reach out on your behalf and help you get it to where you need it to be. In some circumstances, depending on the shift, so if you go from 100 to, let's say, 100,000, we might need some contracts or some prior processing statements or some sort of understanding as to why it's so different and what actually are you selling and what is the industry that this merchant's in that would exceed this. If it's just a small, $100 to $150, if there's something that you feel you want to shift, just let us know. We'll be happy to help. Well, that is it. Those are all the questions. I really appreciate everyone's time, and thank you for staying on with me to answer questions. And if you have any other questions moving forward, we do have some contact information up on the screen for our 3 service departments. Please feel free to reach out. Let us know if you need anything, if you want to talk, if you just have a question, if you feel like something needs to change on one of your merchant accounts, or if you need help having a better understanding on how to get business started with you so that you're eliminating or at least lessening risk reviews. Feel free to reach out. We're happy to help. That's what we're here for. So I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. And I will see you in February for PCI compliance.
Bold Bytes, your bite-sized guide to payments.